So in this video, we will be reading the next chapters in Stalking Jack the Ripper by Carrie Maniscalco. And that means we will be starting on chapter 14. There will not be a gift opening in this video. We actually don't have another one until page 191. So that's a little ways from now. But before we get started, there's another picture before this chapter starts, and it's an afternoon tea in the 19th century. Don't know if you can see it, but there it is. Oh, the ladies drinking their tea and eating their crumpets. I'm just kidding, I have no idea. Anyway, so we'll be picking up on chapter 14. So let's go ahead. Chapter 14. Proper ladies don't discuss corpses. Wadsworth Residence, Belgrave Square, 14 September 1888. Standing in the doorway of our dining room was like gazing upon something familiar yet undeniably foreign at the same time. There were so many place settings laid out, I felt dizzy. Small topiaries were arranged on the table along with several towering banquets of exotic hothouse flowers. Pink and white porcelain cups were awaiting their warm liquid, while their matching plates stood at the ready. "You look as if you're expecting the blade of the guillotine, cousin," Liza said, waltzing into the room. "It's not as if you've been raised by wolves. You've missed only a few months of gossip. You'll catch up in no time," she said. "If you can deal with blood and other horrendous things, a little lace and tea will surely be nothing." I tore my attention away from the table and looked at my cousin. She sounded like my mother for a brief moment, and my nerves settled. I smiled. If Aunt Amelia was the embodiment of what all proper young ladies should aspire to, Liza was her shining protégée. Except Liza had a fascinating way of flaunting tradition when it suited her romantic notions. Growing up, we saw each other only twice a year, but that hadn't prevented her from saying we were the very best of friends. She was 3 months older, which, in her opinion, made her infinitely wiser on all matters, especially those of the heart. Her hair, somewhere between caramel and chocolate, was twisted into an intricate design about her crown. I'd love to fashion mine in a similar way. Her dress was made of watered silk and was of the most gorgeous lavender I'd ever seen. The stitching was superb. A flash of the last cadaver I'd sewn back together crossed my mind. Not to boast, but my stitches had been as good, perhaps a pinch better. "Isn't it grand?" "You could say that," I replied before I could stop myself. Liza turned to me, grinning. "You can play the gossip game nicely today, then go about your secret detective business tonight. It could be just like a novel." She clapped her hands together. "How thrilling! Perhaps I'll tag along with you on some of your adventures. Are there any handsome boys to flirt with? There's nothing better than a little danger dashed with some romance." My thoughts turned to Thomas's face. Liza laughed again, the sound like tinkling bells in a fairy tale. I flushed, struggling to regain my composure. "Not really." "Don't hold back, cousin. This is the best part. Oh, I've an idea. Come." Liza dragged me down the hallway, up the stairs, and into the room we'd set up for her to stay. Before closing the door, she quickly scanned the corridor for her mother. But Aunt Amelia was buzzing about near the kitchen, commanding the staff like a colonel at war. Satisfied we were alone, Liza ushered me over to her dressing table, then pulled out a makeup kit far more complex than my post-mortem tools. "So, what's his name?" She tugged a brush through my hair, pulling and twisting black strands with expert ease. I gritted my teeth, not wanting to show how uncomfortable I was with the harsh primping or topic. Surely if I could sit for Uncle in his laboratory, I could suffer through this. I immediately chided myself. Uncle was trapped in an asylum, and I was only having my hair styled. I needed to keep perspective. "Whose name?" I asked, steering my mind from unpleasant things. For some reason, Thomas was a secret I'd like to keep. "Stop playing coy. The handsome boy who's stolen your heart, that's who." Liza stepped back, admiring her work before grabbing the coal. I tried not to cringe. I'd already lined my eyes lightly and wasn't keen on being made into something I was not. I delicately put a stop to my mind's heavy-handed rouging. "Tell me everything about him," Liza said. What does he looks like, what color his eyes are, if he wants to run away with you to some beautifully exotic paradise, how many children you're going to have. I hope he plays the piano. All good men should be so well-rounded. Oh, tell me he's deliciously smart and writes romantic poetry. I bet he composes Shakespearean sonnets by moonlight with stars dancing in his eyes, doesn't he? I cast my attention down, searching for a way out of the conversation, but my cousin gripped my chin, forcing me to look up while she lined my eyes. She quirked a brow, waiting for my response. Stubbornness was a trait she'd inherited from the Wadsworth side of the family. I sighed. Wasn't I looking forward to sharing this sort of gossip with my cousin a few days ago? His eyes are golden brown when he's intrigued by something. He's regal-looking and handsome, but he's more interested in formulas and solving crimes than he is in me or poetry. He acts devilishly warm one moment, then frigid the next, I said. So there will be no children or any beautiful paradise in our future. Most of the time I cannot even tolerate his presence. His arrogance is, annoying. Silly. Arrogance usually hides something below the surface. It's your duty to unearth it. Liza dabbed my lips with her fingers, then shook her head. It's truly tragic. She handed me a napkin. Now blot. I mimicked her motion of blotting my lips with the napkin, taking careful pains to not smudge the color she'd stained my lips with. When I was done to her satisfaction, she nodded, then pointed to the looking-glass on the vanity. What's tragic? She raised her brows. You're in love with him, and he's most certainly in love with you. You're just both being obtuse. Trust me, I said, facing the looking-glass. He's the foolish one. Well, we must show your foolish boy this girl, then. I'm sure you'd become an equation he desperately enjoys solving. She tapped my nose. Wield your assets like a blade, cousin. No man has invented a corset for our brains. Let them think they rule the world. It's a queen who sits on that throne. Never forget that. There's no reason you can't wear a simple frock to work, then don the finest gown and dance the night away, but only if it pleases you. I stared at Liza for a few beats, seeing her in an entirely new light. She'd nodded toward the looking-glass again, somehow knowing I hadn't truly seen myself before. My reflection shone back, lit almost as if the heavens themselves were shining down on me. Dark strands of hair were piled atop my head, my eyes more mysterious somehow with the dark liner, and my lips were the bright crimson of freshly spilled blood. I was beautiful and dangerous at once, a rose with thorns. I was precisely who I wanted to be. Oh. I turned from side to side, admiring the full look. It's lovely, Liza. You must teach me how to do this. I thought of my mother and the saris she'd brought me to wear from Grandmamma's homeland. I felt just as stunning now as I did then, and the memory warmed me. Mother used to dress us up and hire a cook to make savory delicacies for us every month, hoping to keep the traditions of India alive in us. Father happily participated in our worldly dinners, eating raita and fried beans with his hands. We'd drag Nathaniel in for our feasts, but he was always unimpressed by eating without silverware. He'd say, I cannot tolerate being so messy, then storm out in his little suit. How I missed those simpler days. Liza ran her gaze over my ensemble, then immediately rummaged through her trunk, tossing dresses and corsets and fabrics over her head until she settled on one. What's wrong with my dress? I asked, touching the rose embroidery on the skirts. I just had this one made, and it was quite beautiful. Nothing's wrong with it, silly, Liza said, but I'd love to see you in my tea gown. Ah, here it is. A cream lace gown with pale pink underskirts was promptly thrown over my head and tied in the back before I even knew what was happening. Liza wiped her hands off in a gesture of finality, pleased with her efforts. There. You're darling. I always wished my hair was as dark as yours. Makes the green of your eyes nearly emerald. I stood there, staring at my image. It seemed a horrid contradiction to the reality of the world and what was going on in it. Here I was, playing dress-up while Uncle was in an asylum, and a murderer was butchering innocent women. Liza was at my side, studying me before I collapsed onto the divan. I know, she said sagely, misinterpreting my thoughts. It's a gorgeous gown. You must keep it. Come. It's time to greet our guests. I've heard Victoria and her sister Regina are coming. Their father does something with Parliament, and I've heard the most interesting rumors. It felt as if I were watching, through someone else's eyes, the events unfolding before me. Aunt Amelia sat at the head of the table, a queen holding court during her royal tea. Liza sat on my right, while the esteemed Victoria Edwards sat on my left, her button nose turned prematurely upward. A royal tea was different from high tea in that it began with a glass of champagne and did not include supper. That much I remembered. Sandwiches, savories, scones, and sweets were laid out across the table, more riches and delicacies than all of Nathaniel's favorite imported cheeses and fine foods combined. Uncle's arrest was responsible for my nerves, making me forgetful. It had been only a few months since I'd last attended such a formal tea, and though I didn't care for them, I wasn't normally so distracted. I stirred my tea, then set my spoon behind my cup, as was proper. Victoria turned to me, a slight smile fixed to her face. "I'm so sorry to learn of your uncle, Audrey Rose. Must be quite difficult having such a ruthless criminal in the family." I'd just taken a bite of a cucumber sandwich and barely swallowed my surprise down. Liza jumped in, rescuing me with her quick tongue. "Such a shame. If they can accuse someone as brilliant as our uncle, surely they can accuse just about anyone. Perhaps," she leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper, "they'll set their sights on members of Parliament next. It'd make for a rather sensible story, wouldn't you agree?" Up until that last point, Aunt Amelia had been smiling and nodding, proud of her daughter's appropriate response. When Liza flashed a grin my way, my aunt's face turned a furious shade of red. She'd straightened, then dabbed at her mouth with a lace napkin we'd undoubtedly stitched. "Now, girls," she glanced between us, "let's not allow our imaginations to get away from us. We shouldn't gossip or speculate on such matters. It isn't polite." "But it's true, Mamma," Liza insisted, garnering curious gazes from around the table. "Some royals are under suspicion. It's all everyone in London's talking about." Aunt Amelia looked as if she'd swallowed an egg whole. After a moment she threw her head back and laughed, a sound more forced than her thin smile. "See? This is precisely why speaking of such things is a waste of time and energy. No royal would truly be under suspicion. Now, who'd like more tea?" Victoria, displeased by the turn in conversation, faced me a second time. "You look rather pretty this afternoon, Audrey Rose. To be perfectly honest, I wasn't sure what we'd been invited to, given all the rumors swirling around about your association with that strange assistant of your uncle's. What's his name? Mr. Cresswell?" Another girl, whose name I thought was Hazel, nodded. "Oh, yes. I've heard about him from my brother. Says he's got as much feeling as an automaton. Automaton? Something." She'd smiled wickedly. "Though I've heard he's quite good-looking, and his family does have a title. He can't be all bad." "Mr. William Bradley told me he's got his own flat on Piccadilly Street," Regina added, looking pleased to involve herself in the conversation. "Honestly, what kind of parents allow their son to live on his own before he's come of age? I don't care how rich they are, it isn't proper." She pressed a hand to her chest. "I wouldn't be surprised to discover he's killed those women and hid their bodies away. Maybe Liza's right. Maybe Dr. Wadsworth is innocent, and it's Mr. Cresswell who's truly the madman. I bet he's got a slew of unsavory women coming and going there. He might be heir to a good fortune, but who'd marry such an odd fellow? He'd probably murder his own wife." "Be serious," I said before I could stop myself. "Because he's interested in science hardly makes him a murderer or automaton. In fact, there's absolutely nothing wrong with Thomas. I find him to be quite agreeable." "Mind your tongue, Audrey Rose." Aunt Amelia fanned herself. "Addressing a boy by his Christian name is inappropriate, especially when you're not involved." If I thought my aunt was upset before, this was a whole new level of emotion. How quickly her tea had turned into discussions of the macabre and impolite. The macabre. I am fumbling all over my words today. I held my eye roll in. At least tea was more interesting than I had imagined it be. The other girls quickly lost interest in Thomas Cresswell and the tragic and disturbing murders affecting the lower-class slums. Conversation moved to more suitable afternoon tea subject matters, like who was going to be invited to the Duke's coming-of-age masquerade in 6 months. "You simply must come," Victoria was saying to me, threading her arm through mine, as if we were already the very best of friends, and she hadn't just called my uncle a murderer. "Everyone who's important will be there. If you want the right people attending your party, you'll need to make an effort to attend theirs. I hear he's even hired a spiritualist to perform a séance." As the afternoon wore on, I watched them, noting the role they were all playing. I doubted any of them truly cared about what they were saying and felt immensely sorry for them. Their minds were crying out to be set free, but they refused to unbind them. Hazel leaned across the table, catching my attention. "Your dress is absolutely divine. Would you be terribly bothered if I had one made like it?" When I didn't respond straight away, she amended, "In different colors, naturally. It's just the design is so gorgeous." "If William Bradley doesn't fall to his knees proposing at first glance," Regina said, smearing a scone with curd and cream, "he's a fool and you need to leave him at once." Hazel sighed dramatically. "But he's a fool with a title. You really think he'd propose if I wore a similar gown?" "How could he not?" I teased, holding back laughter at her serious expression. "Surely boys are interested in proposing only to girls in lacy gowns. Why care about beauty and brains when they can have beauty over brains? Foolish creatures they are." Hazel drew her brows together. "Why ever would a girl choose anything over beauty? A wife should abide by her husband in all matters. Let him do the thinking." Both Regina and Hazel nodded at that dreadful sentiment before Hazel continued. "Anyway, you truly are the sweetest thing, Audrey Rose. Will you be attending the circus when it comes to town?" Perhaps I'd been wrong in my earlier judgment. It seemed it'd take a little more time for some girls to free themselves from chains society placed upon them. I bit my lip, thinking of a response that wouldn't offend them further. Victoria, abandoning her conversation with my cousin and aunt, clapped her hands together. "Oh, yes, you simply must join us. We'll coordinate our attire and everything. People won't know who to look at first, the performers or us." My aunt nodded her encouragement from across the table, her expression threatening something more unpleasant than even leather apron could dream up. I smiled tightly. "That sounds lovely." Chapter 15. Greatest Show on Earth, Wadsworth Residence, Belgrave Square, 25 September 1888. "You're not serious," Nathaniel said, shaking his head at another of all my nearly all-black ensembles. I glanced at layers of black, broken up by deep charcoal and silver stripped silk, then lifted a shoulder. "Why have I not? There's nothing wrong with my dress." My corset was pulled tightly over my silky chemise. My gloves were a soft, supple leather with covered buttons running up the sides, and my bustle was annoying me greatly. Judging from how uncomfortable I was, I'd say I was downright stunning this evening. If one could see beyond the dark circles refusing to relinquish their grip on my eyes, or the way the midnight colors accentuated how pale I'd become. The Edwards sisters wouldn't approve of my color choice, but I didn't quite care. I'd attended 3 more of Aunt Amelia's royal teas, and though they weren't as bad as I'd originally anticipated, it left less time for sleuthing. Anyway, "It'd been nearly 2 weeks since Uncle was arrested," I said. "Neither Thomas nor I have found a scrap of information to exonerate him. I'll be dressed in the color of mourning until he's freed, and I don't care if it's fashionable or not." Nathaniel sighed. "I suppose it works well enough for Her Royal Highness. If even the City of London refuses to be anything other than grey and dreary all the time, you might as well act the same." Blessedly, Aunt Amelia and Liza came down the stairs, looking resplendent in hues of emerald and turquoise, the precise color palette Victoria decided on during our last tea. Nathaniel bowed to them. "Good evening, Aunt Cousin. You're both visions." "You're too kind, nephew," Aunt Amelia replied, feigning humility. "Thank you." Liza came over and kissed my cheek, shaking her head ever so slightly. "Your eyes look stunning this evening," she said, looping her arm through mine, completely ignoring the drab color I was in. "I'm so pleased you've taken to the coal. Thomas Cresswell certainly must be in love. Has he commented on it?" I thought on our meetings. Thomas, presented to be more arrogant lately, commenting on how I'd made an effort for him, but then I'd catch him staring as if he were trying to deduce and was unsuccessful for the first time. He wasn't sure if I truly was doing it to entice his affections or for my own purposes, and I suspected it drove him mad. Before I answered, Aunt Amelia waved the question away like a pesky gnat. What does it matter? That boy won't amount to anything in society. His family name might be good, but he's destroyed any decent prospects. Audrey Rose has other, more accomplished suitors coming her way. Come, Liza. She tossed her shawl about her shoulders and headed down the corridor. We'll see you both at the circus. See you there. My brother gripped a letter in his hand, crinkling its edges before smoothing it on his pressed pant leg. He reached for his comb, but thought better of it. Thank goodness. I was certain if he touched one more strand of hair, it'd run away screaming in protest. The image almost made me smile before I caught myself. Are you certain you don't want to change? I thought you were excited for the circus, he said, defeated. All you talked about for the last several months were the curiosities, meanderies, and what of Jumbo? Poor chap's finally come home, and you're greeting him wearing the color of death. What kind of miserable welcome is that for an elephant who's traveled half the world? Aunt Amelia and Liza look like precious stones, while you're making your best Cole impersonation. It simply isn't right. He paced the parlor, hands twitching at his sides. I've got it. How about we dress you in that horse costume? What was it called? The Devil's Auction, or something equally charming? I wanted to smile, but couldn't quite bring myself to do it convincingly. Months ago I cared about things like three-ring stages and larger-than-life elephants. I'd even laughed about the postcard we'd found with a strange horse-head-wearing performer. There are unsolved murders, and Uncle is being held under suspicion, I said. Now isn't the time for levity. Yes. He, along with a slew of other questionable characters, Nathaniel said. According to the papers, Scotland Yard's throwing any person in a cell until their innocence can be proven irrevocably, or until someone more frightening comes about. Uncle will have this sorted out, and you'll have wasted time moping for nothing. I had hardly considered proving his innocence a waste of time. Why police refused to let Uncle out of the asylum, I hadn't a clue. Nathaniel was right. Uncle certainly wasn't the only one being charged with the crimes. News sources are something else entirely. I can't believe you're reading any of it. I'd never seen such sensationalist rubbish strewn across every cover. Reporters couldn't get their fill of Leather Apron. They were creating a star out of a madman, glorifying a villain. The lengths people went through to sell a paper was nearly as disgusting as the crimes themselves. Awful though they may be, the papers offer some amusement, sister. Honestly, I said. The whole thing sours my stomach. Why turn a murderer of women into front-page news? I feel sorry for their poor families. That was enough dabbling in the strange and wonderful for me, thank you kindly. I needn't waste time on distractions. Nathaniel, however, was on a personal mission over the last 12 days to yank me from the depths of my despair. His answer to my troubles came in the form of 2 tickets to the greatest show on earth. Protestations fell upon deaf ears, so I relented. Protestations fell upon deaf ears, so I relented. He had had a disturbing amount of fabric brought over last week in the hope that a new, colorful frock would chase all the dark clouds away. If only life's problems could be solved with a frilly dress and a pair of slippers. To hell with the world around us, so long as we looked our best. Let's be on our way, then, Nathaniel said, checking the grandfather clock. I followed him to the handsome cab, allowing the coachman to help me inside this time, relieved we were taking the fastest means of transportation we owned. I sat in an inky puddle of expensive silks, rearranging my skirts to make room for my brother in the small carriage, my mind churning with different angles to study the case from. Nathaniel sat beside me, looking like a child whose favorite toy had gone missing. I was a wretch of a sister. Here I was, all wrapped up in my own mind, selfishly ignoring the people who were still very much present in my life. You know, I squeezed his hand, I'm getting rather excited about the circus after all. Nathaniel beamed, and I felt mildly redeemed in the court of good deeds, even if I had lied to get there. The Olympia was one of the most magnificent buildings in the kingdom. It rivaled even the palace in its splendor and sheer magnitude. "Look, there it is," Nathaniel said, pointing toward the building. As our carriage pulled up to the enormous stone and iron compound, I watched a train chug by, puffing white clouds into the atmosphere in dizzying intervals. Steam was a fascinating source of power, so readily available and used in so many varying applications. I thought again of Father's unique drawings of old toys and war contraptions. They could be on display all across London, perhaps even in the menagerie, my bad. Perhaps even in the menagerie here tonight for hundreds of people to marvel at. That was, if he hadn't stopped making them. The last train car screeched by and we were off again, making our way to the Olympia's front entrance. People filed in, 4 at a time, all but fighting to catch the first glimpse of the greatest show on earth. "Your friends are over there," Nathaniel said. I caught sight of Victoria and her flock of emerald-colored parrots scanning the crowd, but luckily they disappeared into the building without seeing me. "Shame we missed them," I said. "I hope to avoid them as much as possible this evening. I like them well enough, but wanted to enjoy time alone with my brother." Taking our coachman's hand, I hopped down from the carriage, my heels catching in the cobblestones as I made my way to the line. "Do you smell that?" I asked. "Reminds me of Grandmamma's house." Spicy, sweet incense wafted over the crowd, spilling out through the arched doorway, filling the warm night air with sultry richness. Against my better judgment, my heart joined the mayhem, soaring between my ribs as if it were only of the pretty ladies on the flying trapeze. As if it were one of the pretty ladies on the flying trapeze. Giving into childlike wonder, I grabbed my brother's hand, dragging him through large doors, and into the grandest room in the world. Once inside, I slowly spun in place, my focus riveted on the domed ceiling. "Nathaniel, it's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." The entire roof was made of glass and iron. Each and every last star pricking the sky, it seemed, watched the jeweled crowd, showing off their own dazzling diamond smiles. "Truly, you should spend more time among the living, sister." Nathaniel chuckled at my astonishment, but I couldn't quite tear my attention from the mesmerizing night sky. "Perhaps I will." My hand fluttered to my heart, resting there, as I gazed at slender iron bars arching high above us. I wasn't sure how such a thing was possible. How can so much glass and metal be supported by a smattering of iron branches? It was utterly beautiful, reminding me of looking up through a forest of metal. "Must be one of those engineering wonders of the world," Nathaniel said, grinning. Somehow he managed to escort me further into the chaos. Swaths of alternating black and brightly colored silk hung from rafters, acting as partitions, while billowing toward the crowd, inviting us to come in and be hypnotized by exotic wonders. Little bells and sparkling beads were sewn into the ends of the fabric with gold thread weighing it down, creating a melodic tinkling wherever someone walked in or out, stirring the breeze. "Oh!" I gasped. The luxurious panels reminded me of Grandmamma's Zardozzi's saris, except on a much grander scale. Remember when Grandmamma used to dress me from head to toe in the most elaborate saris? She told the best stories. She said Grandfather had been the British ambassador to India for only a fortnight before proposing. My younger self loved having the gold and crystal embroidered silk tied about my waist and draped over my arms as if I were a princess holding court in her finest gown. I'd listen intently while she detailed how Grandfather had fallen in love with her, claiming it was all due to her lively spirit. Given the fire that crackled in her soul now, I could only imagine what she'd been like in her younger years. Grandmamma told me she'd refused him 20 times just for fun," Nathaniel replied. "Said she squirmed like a cobra in a basket. That's how she knew he was in love. Said he squirmed like a cobra in a basket. That's how she knew he was in love." I'll keep that in mind for future proposals. Those memories warmed me as I took in the rest of the view. Individual stands stood along the perimeter of the cavernous room, giving one the illusion of being in bustling outdoor marketplaces and bazaars of India. People sold everything from imported silks and cashmeres to jewels, fragrant teas, and more food than the Queen probably had at her golden jubilee. Even little circus trinkets were available to take home, should one desire to do so. I found it hard resisting clockwork acrobats and mechanical tigers prowling around one table. "Oh, Nathaniel, look! We must get some." Naan and Batara with chickpea curry caught my attention straight away. My mouth watered with the promise of one of my favorite savory snacks. I couldn't resist its charms, and soon I was dipping flatbread into the creamy chickpea curry and milling around about the vendors like a happy child on holiday. I spied chicken curry and was certainly going to have some before we left. "I'm opting for a less messy version of food," Nathaniel said, paying the vendor. "Suit yourself." I shrugged as he purchased a box of sweets instead. After finishing our snacks, we glided through silk doors and feasted on the show. For a little while I forgot about blood and bolts, even asylums, heartache, and all the horror going on in the world, entranced instead by a stampede of around 100 Arabian horses, prancing about in the most lavish decorations I had encountered yet. Gold chains were pleated through their glossy manes, catching the light and reflecting it back in prisms across their sleek faces, while dyed feathers of greens, yellows, and blues curled into the air a foot above their heads. The horses were well aware of their magnificence, tipping their noses in the air, expecting everyone to ooh and ah appropriately as they passed by. I shook my head. If I'd known I'd be outdressed by a bunch of equines, I might have at least worn a bodice with a few gemstones embellished on it. Nathaniel laughed outright, and I stuck my tongue out. At least I did my makeup and spritzed myself with that new perfume. "Next time perhaps you'll listen to your older, wiser brother. Come." Nathaniel gently tugged me from my wide-eyed wonder and led us to a gilded popcorn machine, looking as if it had been commissioned by the Queen herself. Feeling indulgent, we each got a bag. Then were ushered to our seats by a silent woman wearing a yellow snake coiled around her throat like a living accessory. Traditional Mendi paint swirled and wrapped around her palms, wrists, and feet. We'd passed a booth where women were being painted with enchanting designs. "Oh," I pointed it out to Nathaniel, "I must have my palms painted before we leave." The snake stuck its tongue out, tasting the air as we inched by, then hissed. Nathaniel nearly tripped over the man seated beside the aisle, trying to dodge the reptile. I ran my fingers over its large, leathery head as I passed, stifling a giggle as my brother's eyes bulged and he swiped my hand away. "Are you mad?" he whispered harshly. "That beast tried eating me whole. Now you're making a pet of it? Can't you be normal and like cats?" He shook his head. "If we make it out alive, I'll buy you as many kittens as you'd like. I'll even purchase a farm in the country where you can house hundreds of them." "Don't be so squeamish, Nathaniel." I playfully jabbed his arm. "Being terrified of an animal a woman's parading around like a scarf isn't very becoming, now is it?" With that he huffed, turning his attention on the new act crossing the stage, but I could see a smile curving his lips. The show was everything it promised to be, and then some. There were aquatic arts, more horse acts, and acts taking place high in the sky. Women dressed in outfits made entirely of crystal beads swung from one trapeze to the next, catching their partners' corded arms before letting go and tumbling through the sky, fearless, shining, and free. I glanced at my brother and noticed he was already watching me. "It's good to finally see you smiling, little sister." His eyes misted. I feared I'd never get to see it again. I laced my gloved fingers with his. I hated seeing him upset on a night our worries should be continents away. I opened my mouth to comfort him, then snapped it shut as a shadow darkened my view. An unwelcome patron stepped before us, bending slightly at the waist before setting his gaze on me. "Hello again, Nathaniel." Blackburn extended his hand to my brother. "We met during your father's unfortunate incident. I also had the distinct pleasure of meeting your sister a couple weeks prior." Superintendent Blackburn offered me a polite smile, then returned his attention to Nathaniel, who sat stock still. "I'm afraid I must speak with her for a few moments on official police business." All right, that was the end of Chapter 15. So in the next video, we will pick up on Chapter 16, which says a date to die. Ooh, that's not good. Dum dum dum. Okay, well, I hope you're enjoying the story so far. I'm getting nervous that I'm voicing the characters incorrectly, but I can't seem to pick the right voices anymore. Anyway, hopefully I'm doing okay. If you like this video and you haven't subscribed, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Hit the thumbs up if you liked it. Leave me a comment below. I do get back to all the comments that are left. It may take me a day or two or a couple of days, but I do get back to them. And if you've already subscribed, then thank you so much. Okay, that's it for now. Reading by Ree. Till next time. Bye.